Chapter 1. The Disappearance at Nova 14 Montague Gardens. It has been my custom, during the long and contemplative evening hours which invariably follow our return from a successful or even an inconclusive inquiry, to set down in my journal those remarkable adventures that have fallen to the lot of my extraordinary friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. It is a matter of some regret to me that the public has occasionally been fed with sensational accounts which distort the patient, scientific methods that truly govern his intellect. To those who knew him only through the exaggerations of the daily press, Holmes was a creature of eccentric theatricality. To me, who shared the gaslit shadows of 221B Baker Street through seasons of foul fog and summer drizzle alike, he was primarily an artist whose medium was human truth. The morning in question, a Tuesday late in November of 1894, brought with it an atmospheric gloom peculiar to our metropolis. A dense, saffron-hued pall hung heavily over the tiles of Baker Street, pressing its greasy fingers against the window panes, as if eager to snuff out the solitary warmth of our hearth. Holmes sat in his accustomed armchair, his lean frame folded into an attitude of intense concentration. His fingers were steepled together, his sharp grey eyes fixed upon a small, unremarkable object resting on the corner of the mantelpiece. He had not spoken for the better part of 2 hours, save for an occasional low murmur of dissatisfaction whenever the carriage wheels rumbled too loudly upon the street below. Across the room, Mrs. Hudson had just withdrawn after depositing our breakfast tray. The coffee steamed into the chill air, yet neither of us made a move toward it. My own attention was divided between the leading columns of the Times, which detailed yet another tedious parliamentary debate regarding colonial tariffs, and the motionless figure of my companion. "You are contemplating the ash of a Trichinopoly cheroot, Holmes," I ventured at last, unable to bear the silence any longer. "Or perhaps you find some hidden portent in the dampness of my umbrella." Holmes did not shift his gaze from the mantelpiece at once. When he finally turned, a faint sardonic smile played about the corners of his thin mouth. "Neither, my dear Watson," he said, his voice dropping into that dry, conversational register which always betokened his analytical machinery working at high velocity. "The cheroot ash was disposed of with my usual tidiness at 8 o'clock this morning, and your umbrella, while certainly retaining enough Surrey mud upon its ferrule to suggest a brisk walk through the Wimbledon Commons yesterday afternoon, does not detain my thoughts. I was, in point of fact, observing the singular mental gymnastics of our landlady." I blinked, genuinely surprised. "Mrs. Hudson? What on earth has Mrs. Hudson to do with mental gymnastics? Did you not observe the precise manner in which she balanced the china creamer upon the tray?" Holmes asked, leaning forward and resting his elbows upon his knees. "She approached with her left foot slightly dragged, a sure indication of the rheumatic twinge that invariably visits her during a shift in barometric pressure. Yet, despite the physical discomfort, she arranged the cutlery with absolute symmetry, forks to the left, knives to the right, blades turned inward. Furthermore, she glanced twice at the coal scuttle. It was half empty. She debated within herself whether to replenish it now or wait until the afternoon chill set in. She decided upon the latter, comforting herself with the thought that her afternoon chores would be lighter thereby. A remarkably sound domestic calculation, though executed under duress. I could not suppress a chuckle. "You reduce the simplest domestic act to a mathematical equation, Holmes. Life is infinitely stranger than anything which the mind of man could invent," he replied softly, rising from his chair and crossing to the window to peer out into the yellow fog. "We would not dare to conceive the things which are everyday occurrences in the life of our fellow mortals. Were you to take yourself out into that fog, Watson, you would find human existence operating upon a dozen hidden levers, each as complex as the machinery of a Swiss watch." As if in immediate vindication of his words, a sharp, authoritative knock sounded upon our street-level door. A moment later, the heavy tread of heavy boots echoed upon the wooden staircase, accompanied by the rustle of Mrs. Hudson's skirts as she hurried upward to announce our visitor. "Ah," Holmes murmured, a sudden brightness leaping into his eyes as he turned from the window and rubbed his long, nervous hands together. "It appears that the machinery has brought us raw material before we have even finished our breakfast. A client in acute distress, Watson. Observe the velocity of the steps. They belong to a man who has run a considerable distance through the mire, yet paused upon our threshold to compose his breathing. A man of disciplined habits, but severely shaken. The door flew open, and Mrs. Hudson announced in a breathless flutter, "Mr. Arthur Pendleton, sir." Our visitor was a man of perhaps 40 years, though the deep lines etched across his forehead and the hunted, feverish wildness in his dark eyes made him appear considerably older. He was dressed with scrupulous neatness in a dark Chesterfield overcoat and a silk scarf, but his attire bore unmistakable signs of disorder. His hat was slightly askew, mud spattered the cuffs of his trousers, and his gloved hands trembled so violently that he could scarcely manage the brim of his beaver hat as he crossed the threshold. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" the man gasped, looking frantically from my companion to myself. "This is my friend and associate, Dr. Watson," Holmes said smoothly, stepping forward with that effortless grace which always marked his professional greetings. "Pray close the door, Mrs. Hudson. Mr. Pendleton, you have run from the Strand, or perhaps farther east. The reddish clay upon your left heel is peculiar to the excavations near the new drainage works on Victoria Embankment. Take this armchair, sir. The fire is warm, and Dr. Watson will pour you a cup of coffee. You may speak quite freely." Pendleton sank into the offered seat as though his knees had suddenly turned to water. He stared at Holmes with a mixture of awe and sheer terror, his chest heaving under his tightly buttoned coat. "You know me, Mr. Holmes," he whispered. "You know where I have come from." "I know only what your boots and your demeanor have chosen to reveal," Holmes said lightly, resuming his own seat and steepling his fingers once more. "You are a man of methodical habits who has suffered a profound shock within the last 3 hours. You have journeyed in a hansom cab for the latter half of your transit. Observe the horsehair adhering to the carriage wool of your left shoulder, and you are presently in a state of acute mental agitation regarding a matter which you dare not confide to the ordinary authorities. Am I correct?" Pendleton swallowed hard, running a trembling hand across his brow. "You are terrifyingly correct, sir. I scarcely know where to begin. It is not merely a crime, Mr. Holmes. It is an impossibility. It is a nightmare that defies reason itself." "Such cases are our specialty," Holmes observed, his eyes glinting with professional relish. "Pray compose yourself, Mr. Pendleton, and begin at the very beginning. Who is the victim, and what is the nature of the mystery that brings you to Baker Street?" Our visitor took a long, shuddering breath, staring into the flickering flames of the hearth before he finally raised his eyes to meet Holmes's steady gaze. "There is no victim," Pendleton said in a hollow, trembling voice. "That is the terror of it. My brother Francis has vanished utterly from the face of the earth, but the police refuse to look for him, Mr. Holmes, because they insist upon a truth that is monstrous and incredible. They tell me that Francis never existed at all." Chapter 2: The Impossible Man. The silence that followed Mr. Pendleton's startling declaration was absolute, save for the melancholy hiss of the coal fire and the muffled rumble of traffic filtering up through the foggy panes of Baker Street. Holmes did not move a muscle. His long, slender fingers remained steepled beneath his chin, though a sudden electric alertness flickered in his grey eyes. For my own part, I stared at our distraught visitor, wondering momentarily if the man's mind had given way under the strain of some sudden domestic tragedy. "An impossibility, Mr. Pendleton," Holmes remarked quietly, breaking the stillness at last. "A favorite word of the unobservant, yet one that invariably conceals a simple human error or a deliberate deception. Scotland Yard is an institution staffed by honest and hard-working men, but they are constitutionally ill-equipped to deal with the nuances of identity. Do I understand you correctly? You assert that your brother has vanished, and the police maintain that he is a phantom of your own imagination." Pendleton groaned, pressing his gloved hands against his temples as if to contain a splitting headache. "It sounds madness when you state it aloud, Mr. Holmes. Even now, as I sit in this warm room, I feel as though I am losing my grip upon reality. Yet I swear to you upon my honor, upon the memory of my mother, that Francis is as real as you or I. We grew up together at our family estate in Shropshire. We shared tutors, shared a bedroom until our university years at Cambridge, and for the past 5 years he has lived with me in London, occupying the upper floor of my terrace house at Montague Gardens." "A distinct and verifiable history, certainly," Holmes murmured, drawing his pocketbook and a short pencil from his waistcoat with economical grace. "And what is your brother's profession?" "He is an actuary," Pendleton replied, his voice steadying slightly as the sheer weight of factual detail restored his composure. "He was employed by the Amicable Life Assurance Society in Lombard Street. A quiet, retiring man, somewhat given to solitary book collecting and botanical studies, but entirely dependable. It was his custom to leave the house precisely at 8:30 each morning, catch the omnibus at the corner of Baker Street, and arrive at his desk by 9. And today?" Holmes prompted, jotting a rapid note upon his paper. "Today he did not descend for breakfast," Pendleton said, his eyes widening with a fresh surge of horror. "When the clock struck 9 and he had not appeared, I went upstairs to his bedchamber. The door was unlocked, the room was cold. The bed had been slept in, the indentations upon the pillow and the heavy woolen quilt were quite plain, and his pocket watch, his silver-mounted shaving kit, and his spare spectacles rested upon the dressing table. Yet the room was entirely empty. A man rising early and slipping out unnoticed," I suggested, leaning forward from my chair. "Perhaps an urgent appointment, Mr. Pendleton, or a sudden summons of which you knew nothing." Pendleton shook his head vehemently. "No, Dr. Watson, that is where the nightmare begins. I descended to the ground floor and questioned our housekeeper, Mrs. Corby, who has served us faithfully for a decade. I asked her if she had seen Mr. Francis leave the house. She looked at me with a blank, uncomprehending stare. She asked me, in all sincerity mind you, who I was talking about. "An administrative oversight, surely," I muttered. "A servant grow old in service might easily suffer a lapse of memory or confusion regarding the household roster." "It was not merely the housekeeper," Pendleton cried, his voice rising in pitch. "I went immediately to the neighbors. I spoke to Major Hetherington next door, a man with whom Francis shared a garden gate, and exchanged pleasantries every evening regarding our respective rose bushes. Major Hetherington looked at me as though I were stark raving mad. He assured me, upon his military honor, that I lived entirely alone, that no second man had ever crossed my threshold, and that the upper floor of my house had been used exclusively as a lumber room for storing old trunks since I purchased the property 3 years ago." Holmes's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. A faint, appreciative smile touched his lips. "An ambitious collective hallucination, or an exceedingly thorough conspiracy. Pray continue, Mr. Pendleton. Did you take your grievance to the local precinct?" "Within the hour," Pendleton answered bitterly. "I walked, or rather ran, to the Marylebone police station and poured out the entire narrative to Inspector Lestrade. I expected parties of constables to be dispatched instantly to Montague Gardens. Instead, Lestrade listened with a patronizing, indulgent air that maddened me more than outright hostility. He escorted me personally into the registry office, pulled out the municipal rate books, the census returns, and the parish tax rolls." Pendleton paused, his chest heaving as he relived the humiliation of the morning. "And what did those records reveal?" Holmes asked softly. "They revealed nothing," Pendleton whispered, staring down at the threadbare turkey carpet. "Or rather, they revealed that I am registered as a single occupant. There is no entry for Francis Pendleton anywhere in the parish. The tax assessment is for a single gentleman. The electoral roll lists only Arthur Pendleton. When I demanded that Lestrade accompany me back to the house to inspect Francis's bedroom, to see his books, his clothing, his personal belongings with my own eyes, the inspector humored me like a refractory child. We drove to Montague Gardens in a four-wheeler. We mounted the stairs, and when Lestrade pushed open the door to Francis's bedchamber, Pendleton covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with a suppressed shudder. "What did Inspector Lestrade find, Mr. Pendleton?" Holmes asked, his voice dropping into an almost hypnotic cadence of gentle inquiry. "Nothing," Pendleton choked out. "The bed was made, neatly tucked, uncreased and cold. The dressing table was bare, save for a porcelain vase of dried lavender. The wardrobe contained only a few discarded curtains and an empty hat box. The books, the desk, the papers, the shaving kit, every tangible proof of my brother's existence had vanished as completely as morning mist before a gale." Lestrade looked at me with profound pity, muttered something about nervous exhaustion and the hazards of living alone too long, and advised me to consult a physician rather than a magistrate. "That is why I came to you, Mr. Holmes. I am not mad. I know I am not mad." But if I stay in that house another hour, I shall surely believe that I have lost my reason entirely. A long silence settled over the room. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed, tapping the tips of his fingers together in a steady, rhythmic measure. I watched him closely, knowing well that this quiet concentration meant his formidable intellect was tearing apart the fabric of the mystery, searching for the single thread of falsehood that would unravel the whole. "A remarkably neat piece of domestic legerdemain," Holmes observed at last, opening his eyes and fixing them upon our trembling client. "To spirit away a man is difficult enough in a metropolis of 5 million souls, Mr. Pendleton. But to spirit away the historical record of his existence, to erase him from the rate books, the memories of neighbors, and the physical furniture of a room within the space of a single night, requires an organization and a degree of premeditation that places this far above the common run of metropolitan crimes." "Then you believe me?" Pendleton asked, a desperate ray of hope piercing the gloom of his countenance. "I believe," Holmes said smoothly, rising from his chair and reaching for his tweed ulster from the hallway peg, "that your brother Francis did indeed exist, Mr. Pendleton. Furthermore, I believe that he was a man of very specific habits whose sudden disappearance was engineered with a meticulousness that does great credit to the ingenuity of his adversaries. It is precisely because the police find the problem impossible that it recommends itself to my attention." Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming with the hunter's light that I knew so well. "Come, Watson," he commanded, swinging his heavy scarf around his neck with a practiced flourish. "The morning fog is lifting and Montague Gardens awaits us. Let us see whether the municipality of Marylebone is truly populated by phantoms, or if we are merely dealing with flesh and blood operating behind a very clever screen." Chapter 3. The Empty Chamber. The hansom cab rattled furiously over the cobblestones, its iron-rimmed wheels throwing up a spray of greasy London mud as we made our way northward toward Marylebone. The saffron-colored fog of the early morning had thinned somewhat, replaced by a raw, biting drizzle that coated the gas lamps and turned the brick facades of the residential squares into shades of slate and charcoal. Throughout the transit, Sherlock Holmes sat in near absolute silence. He had wedged himself into the corner of the vehicle, his long legs crossed, his chin buried deep within the folds of his thick woolen scarf. Only his eyes, bright, restless, and intensely alert, scanned the passing stream of pedestrians, dray carts and carriages with the detached scrutiny of a naturalist examining specimens through a lens. I respected his abstraction too much to interrupt, knowing well that the intricate machinery of his mind was weighing the timeline of Mr. Arthur Pendleton against the bizarre testimonies of the housekeeper and the neighbor. Presently, the cab veered sharply down a quiet, respectable side street lined with uniform red brick terrace houses featuring neat white porticos and small iron-fenced front gardens. The driver hauled back upon the reins, bringing the horse to a steaming halt before a gate bearing the porcelain plaque, "No. 14 Montague Gardens." Mr. Pendleton leaped from the cab before the vehicle had entirely settled, his gloved hand trembling as he fumbled with the latch of the gate. Holmes and I followed him up the 3 stone steps to the heavy oak front door. Pendleton produced a heavy brass latch key, inserted it into the lock with frantic haste, and flung the portal wide. "In here, gentlemen," he breathed, stepping aside into a hall that smelled faintly of beeswax, damp wool, and stale pipe tobacco. "I left everything precisely as Inspector Lestrade and I found it 3 hours ago. Not a stick of furniture has been moved." The interior of the house was an exemplar of comfortable, upper-middle-class domesticity. The hallway was carpeted in a rich crimson runner, the walls adorned with tasteful steel engravings of rural landscapes and historical portraits. A gleaming umbrella stand occupied the corner near the coat rack, and upon a small mahogany side table rested a silver card tray. Holmes did not immediately bound up the stairs as our host expected. Instead, he paused just inside the threshold. He dropped to one knee with astonishing agility, bringing his face within a few inches of the crimson carpet near the base of the umbrella stand. He remained there for perhaps 30 seconds, utterly motionless, his nostrils slightly flared as if drawing in the invisible secrets of the dust. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured half to himself, rising smoothly and dusting the knees of his trousers with a casual flick of his fingers. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, stepping close to inspect the floorboards. "Mud from the street, or perhaps some trace left by our client's hasty exit this morning?" "Neither, my dear Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes scanning the wainscoting with sharp precision. "Notice the texture of the carpet pile here by the door. It is slightly compressed in a diagonal swath pointing away from the threshold, yet the individual fibers show no trace of grit or moisture. Had a man entered with muddy boots during the rain this morning, as Mr. Pendleton assured us his brother did every day at 8:30, there would be residual clay or dampness ground into the weave. Instead, we find an immaculate surface, save for the faint imprint of Mr. Pendleton's own boots from his frantic dash out of the house 3 hours ago." Pendleton stared at him, his face pale with bewilderment. "You mean Francis did not return last night, but his umbrella is in the stand. His favorite Malacca cane with the silver crook rests right beside it." "Let us reserve our conclusions until we have inspected the upper domain," Holmes said smoothly, gesturing for our host to lead the way. "Lead on, Mr. Pendleton. Let us examine the theater in which this domestic vanishing act was performed." We mounted the staircase in single file, the wooden steps groaning softly beneath our weight. The upper landing was quiet and dim, illuminated only by a small transom window that cast a pale, watery light across the geometric wallpaper. Pendleton hurried to a white-paneled door situated at the end of the corridor, grasped the porcelain handle, and pushed it open. "This is it," Pendleton whispered, stepping back to allow us entry. "The room belonging to my brother, Francis." I stepped into the chamber, and a strange, involuntary shiver ran down my spine. Holmes had described it as a theater, and the description was apt, though the stage was entirely stripped of its properties. It was a well-proportioned room, boasting a high ceiling, a modest marble fireplace, and a large bay window overlooking the rear gardens of Montague Gardens. Yet the sense of emptiness was absolute and oppressive. In the center of the floor stood a standard mahogany bedstead, neatly made up with a heavy white counterpane, the bolster plumped and smooth without a single crease to suggest it had ever sustained the weight of a human form. Against the far wall stood a large wardrobe of polished walnut. To the right sat a dressing table with an oval mirror, utterly bare save for a small decorative ceramic vase containing a cluster of dry lavender stalks. There were no books upon the shelves. There were no papers upon the writing desk beneath the window. There were no clothes hanging in the wardrobe, no boots neatly aligned beneath the rack, and no personal toiletries upon the washstand. "You see?" Pendleton cried out, throwing his hands up in despair as he paced the bare floorboards. "It is as I told you, every vestige of his life, his library of philosophy, his collection of botanical folios, his clothing, his photographs, has been swept away as though a great sponge had passed over the room. Yet yesterday evening, when I bade him good night over our brandy and soda in the study below, he sat in his favorite armchair reading a newly arrived volume of poetry." Holmes did not answer immediately. He walked slowly into the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his head tilted upward as he absorbed every architectural detail of the space. He walked to the window, ran a finger along the wooden sash, and peered out into the gray drizzle that veiled the neighboring gardens. Then, he turned his attention to the empty wardrobe, pulling the doors wide and dropping to his haunches to examine the floorboards inside. I watched my companion closely, marveling at the meticulous thoroughness of his methods. While an ordinary investigator would have allowed himself to be overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of the missing contents, Holmes looked past the absence of objects to search for the subtle, involuntary footprints that human habitation inevitably leaves behind. "Tell me, Mr. Pendleton," Holmes said, his voice cutting through the silence as he rose from his crouching posture and brushed his fingertips together. "When you purchased this house 3 years ago, what was the condition of the upper floor?" Pendleton blinked, caught off guard by the abrupt change of subject. It was quite bare, sir. The previous owner had used it as a storage loft for old trunks and discarded furniture. I had the decorators in, of course, repainted the walls, laid down this oak parquet flooring, installed the gas fittings, and furnished it entirely for Francis when he moved up from Shropshire to take his position at the Amicable Life Assurance Society. "And who executed the decoration and furnishing?" Holmes pressed, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Did you employ local tradesmen from Marylebone, or did you purchase the items yourself through catalogue houses?" I engaged a firm of builders from the Tottenham Court Road, Messrs. Higgins and Sons, Pendleton replied, knitting his brows in confusion. They handled everything from the wallpaper to the carpet and the bedstead, but what has that to do with my brother vanishing into thin air? Everything, my dear sir, or perhaps nothing at all, Holmes remarked cryptically, stepping toward the empty fireplace and dropping to one knee upon the hearthrug. In the solution of complex problems, one must invariably distinguish between the things that are essential and the things that are merely decorative. Let us see what our silent friend the fireplace has to offer. Holmes produced a small, silver-plated magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket, unfolding it with a crisp click. He leaned forward until his nose was nearly touching the grey ash resting within the iron grate. For several minutes the room remained entirely still, save for the patter of rain against the window pane and the labored breathing of our anxious host. I stood by the door, watching Holmes as he manipulated his lens, shifting a few fragments of carbon with the tip of a pearl-handled pocket knife. "Ah," Holmes breathed softly, a note of quiet satisfaction ringing in his voice. "It appears that our phantom brother was somewhat less careful with his combustion than he was with his municipal registration." "You found something?" I asked eagerly, stepping forward. "A trifle, Watson, yet a highly significant trifle," Holmes said, lifting a microscopic scrap of charred paper upon the blade of his knife and holding it up to the dim light of the window. "Look closely, old fellow. What do you make of the ink upon this fragment?" I peered over his shoulder. Clinging to the blackened edge of the paper was a tiny speck of deep blue-black pigment, distinct from the grey ash surrounding it. "It is standard iron gall ink," I observed, squinting at the minute specimen, used by clerks and accountants throughout the city. "Precisely," Holmes agreed, his eyes gleaming with a hunter's triumph, and observed the texture of the paper itself, coarse, laid linen with a watermark representing a portion of a heraldic lion. "It is a page from an insurance ledger, or perhaps an actuarial calculation sheet. More importantly, it was burned within the last 12 hours. Had this room been unused for 3 years, as Major Hetherington and the parish rate books assert, the hearth would contain only the accumulated soot of dormant chimneys, not the fresh carbon of business documents consumed in haste." Pendleton let out a ragged gasp of vindication. "Then he was here. Francis was in this room last night. The neighbors and the police are lying, or they are part of some monstrous conspiracy against me." "Let us not leap hastily to accusations of conspiracy, Mr. Pendleton," Holmes cautioned gently, standing up and dusting his hands once more. "Conspiracies require vast amounts of money, coordination, and human error, 3 things which rarely coexist harmoniously in the real world. What we have here is not a supernatural vanishing act, nor a collective madness on the part of Marylebone. We are witnessing an act of erasure so thorough and executed with such breathtaking audacity that it presupposes an adversary of extraordinary intellect." Holmes strode to the door, motioning for us to follow him back out onto the landing. As we descended the stairs toward the ground floor, his brow furrowed in deep, concentrated thought. "Mr. Pendleton," Holmes said abruptly as we reached the warmth of the hall, "we have inspected the stage. Now it is time to examine the backstage machinery. You mentioned that your brother was employed at the Amicable Life Assurance Society in Lombard Street. I suggest we take a hansom downtown immediately. Let us see what the ledger keepers of Lombard Street have to say about a man who supposedly never existed." Chapter 4. The Ledger of Lombard Street. The journey from the quiet respectability of Marylebone down into the bustling commercial arteries of the City of London was accomplished through a thick, sulphurous drizzle that seemed to choke the very breath from the metropolis. As our hansom cab clattered past the imposing grey facade of St. Paul's Cathedral, its towering dome half swallowed by the low-hanging autumn vapours, the character of the streets underwent a profound transformation. The quiet residential squares gave way to a relentless press of dray carts, hurrying clerks clutching leather portfolios, and the ceaseless deafening roar of financial commerce centered around Lombard Street and the Royal Exchange. Throughout the transit, Mr. Arthur Pendleton sat bolt upright on the leather-stuffed bench of the cab, his gloved hands clenched tightly around the ivory handle of his walking stick. His breath came in shallow, nervous gasps, and his eyes darted from side to side as though he expected every passer-by to point an accusing finger at him. Sherlock Holmes, by contrast, appeared entirely relaxed. He had pulled his traveling cap low over his brow and produced a small leather-bound notebook from his pocket, upon which he jotted rapid, cryptic symbols with a stub of a pencil. He did not speak until our vehicle slowed to a halt before a massive, soot-stained Portland stone building bearing the carved brass inscription, "The Amicable Life Assurance Society." "Here we are, Mr. Pendleton," Holmes announced cheerfully, snapping his notebook shut with a crisp click and springing lightly from the cab before the driver had even fully secured the reins. "Let us step inside out of this abominable drizzle and consult the ultimate arbiters of human existence in Victorian London, the accountants." We alighted onto the slippery flagstones and mounted a broad flight of granite steps flanked by heavy iron gas lamps. Pushing open the swinging mahogany doors, we entered a vast, echoing marble hall that smelled powerfully of damp wool, coal smoke, and the unmistakable dry scent of millions of paper folios. Rows of high mahogany writing desks stretched into the gloom, behind which dozens of clerks in black alpaca jackets scratched furiously away with steel-nibbed pens, their heads bowed beneath the amber glow of brass bankers' lamps. Pendleton hurried directly toward a raised oak enclosure marked Chief Registrar, where an elderly man with a bald patty and spectacles, perched precariously upon the tip of his nose, was inspecting a massive ledger. "Mr. Witherspoon," Pendleton cried out, gripping the wooden partition with white-knuckled fingers. "Thank God you are still here. I must speak with you immediately concerning Francis, concerning my brother." The elderly clerk looked up, blinking through his lenses with an expression of mild bureaucratic annoyance that quickly curdled into polite bewilderment as he recognized our companion. "Ah, Mr. Pendleton," Witherspoon murmured, laying his pen across a ceramic rest. "An unusual hour for you to visit the city, and certainly an irregular manner of addressing the staff. How may the society assist you today? Is there an irregularity in your quarterly annuity remittance?" "An irregularity," Pendleton repeated, his voice cracking with rising hysteria. "My brother, Witherspoon, Francis, he has not appeared at his desk this morning. I came straight from his empty bedroom at Montague Gardens to find out why he was absent from the audit department, and your junior clerks downstairs looked at me as though I were speaking in tongues. They told me, they actually had the audacity to tell me, that no such man has ever been employed by the Amicable Life Assurance Society." Mr. Witherspoon's eyebrows rose slowly, disappearing into the pale fringe of hair surrounding his polished crown. He adjusted his spectacles, staring down at Pendleton with a mixture of professional disapproval and genuine concern. "My dear Mr. Pendleton," Witherspoon said softly, leaning over the counter in a fatherly manner, "you are overwrought. The autumn fogs try the nerves of even the most robust constitutions. But surely you cannot be serious. You are a bachelor, sir. You have lived alone in that terrace house in Marylebone since you inherited the property from your uncle 3 years ago." Pendleton staggered backward as though he had received a physical blow. A low moan escaped his lips, and he clutched at the edge of the mahogany partition for support. "You too, Witherspoon. You who have signed his salary drafts every Friday afternoon for 5 solid years. You stand there and tell me he never existed." "I must protest this tone," Witherspoon replied, his dignity ruffled as he stiffened his spine. "I have known you as a most respectable client and a man of sober habits, Mr. Pendleton, but this strange fantasy regarding a non-existent brother is quite beyond the pale. No man named Francis Pendleton has ever set foot in these offices as an employee. If you doubt my word, I invite you to inspect the staff registry for yourself." Before Pendleton could collapse entirely under the weight of this second betrayal, Sherlock Holmes stepped smoothly into the gap. With a courteous bow that instantly disarmed the offended registrar, Holmes slid his card across the polished wood. "Mr. Witherspoon, I am Sherlock Holmes," my companion said in his most winning conversational tone. "My name may perhaps be familiar to you from certain inquiries conducted for the Home Office and various financial institutions within the city." The registrar's expression shifted instantly from hauteur to profound awe. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the consulting detective. Good heavens, sir. I have read of your exploits in the Pall Mall Gazette, but surely even your formidable talents cannot manufacture a human being out of thin air." "On the contrary, my dear sir, my profession consists entirely of rescuing human beings from the more imaginative fictions of their neighbors," Holmes replied with a light, disarming laugh. "We are not here to accuse you of collusion, Mr. Witherspoon. We are merely investigating a very singular puzzle. Would you be so good as to indulge us by opening the employment ledgers for the past 5 years, starting from the autumn of 1889? "Certainly, Mr. Holmes, most certainly," Witherspoon stammered, visibly flattered by the attention. He turned and pulled a massive leather-bound volume embossed with gold lettering from the shelf behind him, slamming it down upon the counter with a heavy thud. "Here are the records of every clerk, actuary and auditor engaged by the Society since its incorporation under the Joint Stock Companies Act. You may examine every page at your leisure." Holmes leaned over the counter, opening the heavy tome with practiced ease. I stood on his left, while Mr. Pendleton hovered behind us like a ghost, his eyes hollow and fixed upon the yellowed pages. For 20 minutes, the only sound in that corner of the vast hall was the scratching of distant pens and the muffled murmur of financial transactions. Holmes turned page after page, his keen grey eyes scanning columns of names, dates, addresses, and salary disbursements written in copperplate calligraphy. I watched his face closely. There was no flicker of disappointment, no sign of confusion. Instead, a quiet, intense concentration settled over his features, his lips pursed in a silent whistle. "Here we are," Holmes murmured at last, pointing a long, clean finger halfway down the left-hand column of a page dated November 1889. "Let us inspect the entries for the actuarial department." Witherspoon leaned forward, peering over Holmes's shoulder. "Ah, yes, that is the ledger for the autumn hiring cycle following the retirement of old Mr. Abernathy." "Precisely," Holmes said. He ran his finger down the list of names: Bartholomew, Higgins, Pendleton. I caught my breath. There, clearly inscribed in neat black iron gall ink, was the entry: Francis Pendleton, Actuarial Assistant, Grade 2. Residence, No. 14 Montague Gardens, Marylebone. Salary, £120 per annum. Good God, Mr. Witherspoon gasped, stumbling backward against the bookshelf as though he had looked upon a phantom. He rubbed his eyes furiously with the back of his hand and leaned down again to inspect the page. That is impossible. I drafted this very page myself. I personally interviewed every candidate on this list. Why did I not see that name a moment ago when I looked through the registry?" "Because, my dear Witherspoon," Holmes said calmly, turning the heavy page to examine the reverse side, "human perception is extraordinarily easily managed when an adversary possesses sufficient ingenuity, access, and a bottle of very fine chemical eradicator." Holmes tilted the page toward the amber glow of the banker's lamp, pointing out a microscopic discoloration in the paper fibers surrounding the name. "Look closely at the margin," Holmes instructed, gesturing with the tip of his pencil. "Do you observe the slight roughness of the rag paper here, and the faint halo of bleached white where the surrounding fibers have been chemically treated? This entry was not printed there by divine providence, nor was it miraculously inserted by a ghost. It was restored." "Restored?" Witherspoon echoed, bewildered. "Restored from what?" "From nothing," Holmes answered coolly, closing the massive ledger with a sharp thud that echoed through the marble hall. "Or rather, from a blank space that was deliberately created 2 nights ago by someone who had access to this vault after hours, armed with a knife, an eraser, and a chemical solvent capable of lifting fresh ink without disturbing the surrounding sizing." The entry for Francis Pendleton was carefully scraped away and rendered invisible throughout every official ledger, census return, and parish tax roll in London, creating the illusion that he never existed. Then, once our clever antagonist had finished his nocturnal labor, he simply applied a weak solution of gallatanic acid to restore the vanished text, just enough to leave a tantalizing breadcrumb for us to find. Pendleton stared at Holmes in mounting horror and awe. "You mean someone deliberately wiped him out of existence and then brought him back on paper just to mock me?" "Not to mock you, Mr. Pendleton," Holmes corrected softly, his eyes flashing with the cold, hard light of the hunter who has finally sighted his prey. "To terrify you, or perhaps to drive you to a very specific conclusion regarding your own sanity." Holmes turned sharply away from the counter, pulling his trench coat tighter about his throat as he scanned the bustling, indifferent throngs of clerks and merchants moving through the great hall. "Come, Watson, come, Mr. Pendleton," Holmes commanded, striding rapidly toward the main exit. "The game is afoot. We have discovered how the phantom was unmade. Now it remains for us to discover who among your acquaintances possesses the scientific knowledge, the administrative access, and the murderous motive to turn a living, breathing man into a ghost." Chapter 5. The Secret Clue. The hansom cab bore us back westward through the heart of the metropolis at a breakneck pace, the horses' hooves ringing sharply upon the wet stones as the afternoon shadows lengthened into a slate-grey twilight. Inside the carriage, Mr. Arthur Pendleton sat huddled in the corner like a man aged 10 years by a single morning of terror, his fingers nervously plucking at the fringe of his woolen scarf. He stared fixedly out the window at the blurred pageant of London omnibuses and hurrying clerks. Yet I knew his mind was trapped in that nightmare world where Holmes possessed no upstairs chambers and brothers vanished without a trace. Sherlock Holmes, by contrast, was in a state of suppressed, electric exaltation. He had wedged himself opposite our client, his lean knees nearly touching mine, his eyes gleaming with the fierce, cold light of an intellectual predator closing in on its quarry. He had not spoken a word since we left the granite steps of the Amicable Life Assurance Society in Lombard Street, but his long, nervous fingers tapped a rapid, silent rhythm against the polished head of his walking stick. "Holmes," I ventured at last, unable to contain my curiosity any longer as we rumbled past the imposing stone bulk of the law courts. "We have established that Francis Pendleton's employment records were meticulously eradicated and then cleverly restored with chemical solvents. We have confirmed that the parish rate books and neighbors' memories have undergone an equally thorough falsification. But for what ultimate purpose? Who could possess the means, the technical audacity, and the profound malice required to unmake a man in the heart of Victorian London?" Holmes turned his sharp grey eyes toward me, a faint sardonic smile playing about the corners of his thin mouth. "You use the word malice, my dear Watson, as though human actions were universally governed by passion or revenge," Holmes said, his voice dropping into that dry, clinical register which always betokened his analytical machinery working at peak velocity. "Yet 9 times out of 10, in crimes of this intellectual magnitude, passion is entirely absent. We are dealing with cold, calculated self-interest. Consider the elements: an actuary employed by a major financial institution, a quiet domestic routine in Marylebone, an inheritance of property, and an adversary who operates with the precision of a master surgeon. We are not looking for a madman, Watson. We are looking for an accountant who understands the vulnerabilities of the legal and financial machinery of the state." "An accountant?" Pendleton gasped, turning his pale, haunted face toward us. "Are you suggesting that someone at the office, someone like Witherspoon, wants to ruin me?" "Mr. Witherspoon is an honest bureaucrat whose administrative imagination does not extend beyond the balancing of quarterly columns," Holmes replied smoothly, patting our client's trembling arm with a reassuring gesture. "No, Mr. Pendleton, the mastermind behind this ingenious deception, occupies a much closer orbit. He is a man who knows your habits, who possesses a key to your house, and who has had ample opportunity to study the architecture of your daily life." Pendleton's jaw dropped. "A closer orbit? But apart from our housekeeper, Mrs. Corby, and Major Hetherington next door, no one crosses our threshold save for business acquaintances and—" He stopped abruptly. The color drained entirely from his cheeks, leaving him as grey as the London fog pressing against the carriage glass. "And whom, Mr. Pendleton?" Holmes prompted softly, leaning forward. "Dr. Marcus Gray," Pendleton whispered, the name dropping from his lips like a leaden weight. "Our family physician and my oldest friend from our university days at Cambridge. He has dined with Francis and me nearly every Thursday evening for the past 3 years. He has free run of the house. On several occasions when Francis was suffering from his chronic bronchial cough, Marcus even climbed the stairs to administer medicine in that very upper room." A long silence settled inside the cab. I watched Holmes closely. My companion did not express surprise. Instead, he merely nodded with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose theoretical deduction had just been confirmed by empirical observation. "Dr. Marcus Gray," Holmes repeated, rolling the name over his tongue as if tasting its flavor. "A physician with a taste for biological chemistry and a consulting room just 3 blocks away from Montague Gardens. How remarkably convenient. A doctor knows precisely how to administer subtle narcotics that leave no trace in the system. A doctor has access to chemical solvents in his dispensary, and a doctor, by virtue of his professional standing, commands the implicit trust of both the local police inspector and the neighboring gentry. "But why?" Pendleton cried, his voice breaking with anguish. "What possible reason could Marcus have for destroying my brother? Francis and he were on the best of terms. They discussed botanical specimens and classical literature over our claret. Let us reserve our final judgment upon Dr. Gray until we have gathered our remaining threads," Holmes said, checking his silver pocket watch as our cab slowed to a halt outside number 14 Montague Gardens. "We have a great deal of ground to cover before nightfall, and I suspect our medical friend is presently enjoying a very comfortable sense of security." We alighted from the hansom and paid the driver. The raw, biting drizzle had ceased, leaving in its wake a thick, clammy blanket of evening fog that turned the gas lamps of Marylebone into pale, haloed blurs against the darkening sky. Pendleton fumbled with his latchkey, his hands shaking so violently that the brass scraped twice against the oak before the lock finally gave way. We stepped into the dim, quiet hallway of the terrace house. The air inside felt heavy, smelling faintly of beeswax, cold hearth ash, and the damp wool of our own coats. "Wait here for a moment, Mr. Pendleton," Holmes commanded quietly, halting our host before he could mount the stairs. "Dr. Watson and I have a brief domestic inspection to perform. Do not disturb us, and keep the front door secured." Without waiting for a reply, Holmes slipped off his heavy ulster, tossed it onto the mahogany chair, and crept toward the rear of the ground-floor corridor with the silent feline grace of an experienced tracker. I followed closely behind him, my boots making no sound upon the crimson runner. At the end of the hall lay the study, a comfortable, book-lined sanctuary where the brothers Pendleton were accustomed to spending their evenings. The door stood slightly ajar, casting a thin sliver of pale twilight across the floorboards. Holmes pushed the door wide with 2 fingers. The room was cold and dark, the hearth filled with the grey, uncleaned ash of the previous night's fire. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back from the rear window, which looked out upon the narrow, walled garden shared with Major Hetherington's property next door. Instead of approaching the desk or the bookshelves, Holmes walked directly to the small mahogany writing table, situated in the corner near the window, the very desk where Francis Pendleton supposedly sat each evening, reading his newly arrived volumes of poetry. "Observe the blotter, Watson," Holmes whispered, dropping to one knee and drawing his small silver magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket. I knelt beside him, peering down at the red leather pad resting upon the desk. To the naked eye, the surface appeared clean, save for a few faint smudges of dust. But as Holmes angled his magnifying glass and struck a wax vesta to illuminate the leather surface at an oblique angle, a series of indented impressions leaped into visibility, scratched into the soft leather by a hard steel pen pressing down through several sheets of paper. "Read them to me, Watson," Holmes instructed softly, holding the match steady as the flame flickered dangerously close to his fingertips. I squinted at the faint, mirrored depressions running across the lower right-hand corner of the leather pad. The handwriting was sharp, angular, and educated, entirely distinct from the heavy, sloping copperplate of Arthur Pendleton. "The first installment," I read aloud, my voice hushed in the dim room, "has been successfully transferred to the account at the Union Bank of Australia under the name of Francis Vance. The remaining securities will be liquidated upon completion of the medical certificate." I stopped, drawing in a sharp breath. The name struck me with the force of a physical blow. "Francis Vance." "Vance," I repeated, looking up at Holmes with astonishment. "Holmes, did you hear that? The name in the ledger entry is Francis Vance, not Francis Pendleton. Our client's brother was using an alias, or perhaps—" "Quiet, old fellow," Holmes hissed, extinguishing the match with a swift pinch of his fingers as a sharp metallic sound echoed from the rear garden outside the window. We both froze. Through the glass pane, half obscured by the gathering fog and the tangled branches of a leafless privet hedge, a tall, cloaked figure was moving stealthily along the narrow brick pathway dividing number 14 from Major Hetherington's estate next door. The man carried a small dark leather bag in his left hand, and as he paused beneath the rear window to adjust his collar, the pale amber glow of a distant street lamp illuminated his profile. It was a refined, clean-shaven face with sharp, aristocratic features, and cold, calculating eyes. The face of a physician. It was Dr. Marcus Gray. Holmes rose to his feet with incredible swiftness, a brilliant, triumphant smile illuminating his features in the gloom. He stepped back from the window, pulling me into the shadow of the velvet curtains. "The secret clue is exposed, Watson," Holmes murmured, his eyes glittering with the ecstasy of the hunt. "Our phantom brother did not vanish into thin air. He simply changed his name, liquidated his brother's estate through a clever forgery, and prepared to board a steamer for Melbourne under the identity of Francis Vance. And our good friend Dr. Gray has returned to finish the administrative details." Before I could reply, a soft, cautious tap sounded upon the rear French doors leading from the garden into the study. "Keep completely silent, Watson," Holmes whispered, his hand resting reassuringly upon the butt of the heavy service revolver concealed in his coat pocket. "Dr. Gray is about to discover that Baker Street has anticipated his medical prescription." Chapter 6. The Doctor's Diagnosis. The name I had just deciphered from the indented leather of the blotter, Francis Varden, hung in the chill air of the darkened study, a silent testament to the vast deception unfolding beneath the roof of No. 14 Montague Gardens. Yet there was no time to ponder the implications of this newly discovered alias. The soft, metallic scrape at the rear French doors demanded our absolute and immediate attention. Through the glass panes, the atmospheric conditions of the evening had undergone a startling transformation. The oppressive sulphurous fog that had choked the metropolis all afternoon had been swept away by a sudden biting wind from the east. The sky was now entirely clear, a vast vault of indigo studded with sharp, icy stars glittering above the chimney pots. A bitter hoarfrost had already begun to rim the edges of the leafless privet hedge and the brick pathway, rendering the garden in stark, silver-edged silhouettes. It was against this frigid, starlit backdrop that Dr. Marcus Gray made his stealthy approach. Holmes pressed himself flat against the heavy velvet drapery, his right hand buried deep in the pocket of his ulster, resting upon the grip of his revolver. I mirrored his posture on the opposite side of the window frame, holding my breath as the brass handle of the French doors turned with agonizing slowness. A faint click echoed through the silent room, the unmistakable sound of a well-oiled skeleton key turning the wards of the lock. The door swung inward, bringing with it a rush of air so cold it seemed to burn the lungs. Dr. Gray stepped over the threshold with the practiced, noiseless tread of a feline. He was a tall man, possessing that austere, aristocratic bearing often found among the upper echelons of the medical profession in Harley Street. His silver-streaked hair was immaculately smoothed beneath a dark silk top hat, and the collar of his heavy astrakhan overcoat was turned up against the biting frost. In his left hand, he gripped a physician's black leather Gladstone bag. He paused just inside the room, shutting the glass doors behind him with a soft click. For a long moment, he stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly as he listened to the silence of the house. Satisfied that his entry had gone undetected, he moved directly toward the mahogany writing desk where Holmes and I had crouched only moments before. Gray set his leather bag upon the carpet, reached into his waistcoat, and withdrew a small silver instrument that glinted in the starlight. It was not a medical implement, but a highly refined burglar's jimmy. With expert precision, he inserted the thin wedge into the seam of the lowest desk drawer, applied a steady pressure, and snapped the internal lock with a sharp crack that sounded like a pistol shot in the quiet room. "A remarkably cold evening for a garden stroll, Doctor," Holmes's voice rang out, cool and perfectly modulated, shattering the stillness. Before Gray could even flinch, Holmes struck a wax vesta against the heel of his boot and touched the flame to the gas bracket upon the wall. A harsh yellow light flooded the study, illuminating the tableau with ruthless clarity. "Doctor." Gray spun around, dropping the silver jimmy to the floor. His pale, intelligent eyes widened for a fraction of a second, darting from Holmes's relaxed, commanding figure to my own tense stance by the curtains. Yet, to his immense credit, the physician did not panic. The brief flash of alarm vanished behind a mask of professional indignation, and he drew himself up to his full height, his lips thinning into a hard line. "Who the devil are you?" Gray demanded, his voice possessing the resonant, commanding timbre of a man accustomed to being obeyed in the surgical theater. "And what are you doing lurking in the shadows of my patient's home?" The first question is easily answered, Holmes replied, stepping away from the curtains and clasping his hands casually behind his back. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. John Watson. As to your second inquiry, I might pose the very same question to you, Dr. Gray. It is highly irregular for a medical man to enter a patient's house via the garden door, in pitch darkness, armed with a skeleton key and a crowbar. Gray's gaze flickered toward the forced drawer, then back to Holmes. A cold, cynical smile touched the corners of his mouth. Sherlock Holmes, the doctor repeated, uttering the name with a mixture of amusement and profound weariness. Ah yes, the celebrated amateur detective. I should have expected this. Arthur's paranoia has finally reached its zenith. I presume he came weeping to your rooms in Baker Street this morning, spinning wild tales of a vanishing brother and a great conspiracy among his neighbors. He did indeed, Holmes said mildly, and we have spent the better part of the day tracing the remarkable sequence of chemical erasures that have wiped Francis Pendleton from the municipal records of London. A masterful piece of work, Doctor. Your knowledge of galvatinic solvents does credit to your university training. Gray let out a short, harsh laugh that held no genuine mirth. He reached into his coat pocket. I tensed, preparing to draw my weapon, but he merely produced a silver cigarette case. He selected a Turkish cigarette, struck a match, and inhaled deeply, blowing a plume of blue smoke into the chilly air of the study. You are a very clever man, Mr. Holmes, Gray said smoothly, his composure entirely restored. You observe the erased ledgers, you observe my clandestine entry, and you instantly construct a brilliant narrative of embezzlement, forgery, and murder. It is a beautiful theory, but like many beautiful things, it is fundamentally flawed, because it is built upon a foundation of absolute lunacy. Lunacy? I echoed, stepping forward. We have seen the burned remnants of the actuarial ledgers in the hearth upstairs. We have seen the indented impression on the blotter, indicating a transfer of funds to an alias named Francis Varden. Gray turned his sharp eyes upon me, shaking his head with a look of profound, almost tragic pity. Dr. Watson, as a fellow medical man, I would have expected you to possess a sharper diagnostic eye, Gray said softly. Look at the facts, gentlemen. You are hunting a ghost. You assume that Arthur Pendleton and Francis Pendleton are two separate men. Have you considered the far more tragic, medical reality? Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, though his posture remained indolent. Pray, enlighten us, Doctor. Arthur Pendleton is profoundly, hopelessly insane, Gray declared, his voice dropping to a solemn whisper. He suffers from a severe dissociative disorder, a fracturing of the mind brought on by the trauma of his youth. There was a Francis Pendleton once, yes. He died of typhoid fever 15 years ago in Shropshire, when the brothers were merely boys. Arthur, unable to process the grief, absorbed his brother's identity. For years, Arthur has lived a dual life. He is Arthur, the gentleman of leisure, and he is Francis, the quiet actuary. I stared at the doctor, my mind reeling as the implications of his words struck home. You are saying that Arthur Pendleton worked at the Amicable Life Assurance Society himself, under a false name? Exactly, Gray nodded, taking another drag from his cigarette. Arthur is a master of disguise and chemical alteration. He secured the employment, he forged the documents, and he lived half his week as Francis. But the strain of maintaining two separate lives eventually eroded his sanity completely. 2 nights ago, the Francis persona began to liquidate the estate's assets, transferring them to the Union Bank of Australia under yet another alias, Francis Varden. The Arthur persona discovered this, panicked, and chemically erased every trace of Francis from the records in a desperate attempt to kill his alter ego and regain control of his mind. It was a breathtaking counter-narrative.